In the winter of 1943, Luftwaffe pilots stationed along the Western Front began reporting something unusual. They were encountering an American twin-engine fighter that looked wrong, awkward, heavy, with twin booms and a central nacelle that made it resemble two planes welded together. It was the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, and every German pilot who saw one for the first time thought the same thing. This plane should be easy to kill. The P-38 violated every principle of fighter design that the Luftwaffe had perfected. It was large, nearly twice the size of a Messerschmitt Bf 109. It had two engines when every successful fighter had one. Its twin-boom configuration created drag and made it look sluggish. And in a turning dogfight, the kind of combat that defined air warfare over Europe, it was clumsy, unable to match the tight circles of German single-engine fighters. But within weeks of first encountering the Lightning, German squadrons were filing reports that didn't make sense. Experienced aces were being shot down, entire formations were being decimated, and the P-38, the plane that looked like a design mistake, was racking up kill ratios that shouldn't have been possible. Major Hans-Joachim Marseille, one of the Luftwaffe's most decorated pilots, encountered a flight of P-38s over Tunisia in February 1943. He had 158 confirmed kills and was considered untouchable in a dogfight. He engaged the Lightnings with confidence, diving in from above and pulling into a tight turn to get behind them. The P-38s didn't try to turn with him. They climbed, straight up at full throttle, disappearing into the sky faster than Marseille could follow. When he tried to chase, his Bf 109 began to shudder, the engines straining in the thin air. The Lightnings kept climbing, and then they rolled over and came back down, diving at speeds that turned them into blurs. Marseille broke off the engagement and returned to base. In his after-action report, he wrote a single sentence: "This aircraft does not fight like a fighter. It fights like something else." He was killed 3 weeks later, not by a P-38, but by mechanical failure during a routine patrol. But his report circulated among Luftwaffe squadrons, and other pilots began to echo his assessment. The P-38 didn't dogfight. It didn't need to. It used speed, altitude, and raw power to dictate the terms of engagement. And German fighters, designed for agility and turning performance, had no answer for it. The P-38 Lightning had been developed by Lockheed in the late 1930s as a high-altitude interceptor. It was built around two Allison V1710 engines, each producing more than 1,000 horsepower. It had a top speed of over 400 miles per hour, a service ceiling above 40,000 feet, and a range that allowed it to escort bombers deep into enemy territory. It was armed with 4 50-caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon, all mounted in the nose, which meant no convergence issues and devastating firepower concentration. On paper, it was an exceptional aircraft, but in practice, it had problems. The early models suffered from engine failures in cold weather. The cockpit heating was inadequate, causing pilots to suffer frostbite on long missions. The control surfaces froze at high altitude, and in low-speed turning fights, the plane was a death trap. German pilots who survived encounters with P-38s learned quickly, if you could force a Lightning into a slow, tight turn, you could kill it. But if you let it dictate the fight, you were dead. By mid-1943, Luftwaffe intelligence had compiled a classified assessment of the P-38. The document, titled Tactical Analysis of American Twin-Engine Fighter, was distributed to squadron commanders across occupied Europe. It acknowledged the Lightning's speed and firepower, but it also emphasized its weaknesses: poor maneuverability at low speeds, vulnerability in sustained turning engagements, and a tendency for pilots to rely too heavily on vertical tactics. The report concluded with a recommendation: engage only when altitude advantage is lost. Force close-range turning combat. Avoid head-on passes and vertical pursuits. The German pilots who followed that advice survived. The ones who didn't became statistics. And slowly, grudgingly, The Luftwaffe began to understand that the P-38 Lightning wasn't a mistake. It was something far more dangerous, a fighter designed for a kind of war they hadn't prepared for. But the plane's reputation in the Luftwaffe would be sealed not by tactics or statistics, but by a single engagement over the skies of Germany in the autumn of 1943. An engagement that would become known, in whispered conversations among surviving German pilots, as the day the Twin Devils came. And it began with a pilot who had never flown a P-38 before being ordered to intercept a bomber formation alone. Lieutenant Richard Bong had been flying P-38 Lightnings in the Pacific Theater for 18 months when he was temporarily reassigned to the European front in September 1943. He had 42 confirmed kills, more than any American pilot at the time, and he had developed tactics for the Lightning that emphasized its strengths while minimizing its weaknesses. He didn't dogfight, he didn't turn. He climbed, dove, and killed with surgical precision. And he never stayed in one place long enough for the enemy to react. On the morning of October 14, 1943, Bong was conducting a familiarization flight over occupied France when he received an urgent radio call. A formation of B-17 bombers was under attack by German fighters near the Belgian border. The escort had been scattered and the bombers were taking heavy losses. Bong's P-38 was the closest Allied fighter in the area. He was ordered to intercept. He arrived to find chaos. 12 B-17s were strung out across the sky, trailing smoke and debris. German Bf-109s and FW-190s were swarming them, making repeated passes and tearing the formation apart. Bong counted at least 20 enemy fighters. He was alone. He didn't hesitate. He pushed the throttles forward, climbing above the engagement, and then rolled into a steep dive. The P-38 accelerated like a falling stone, the airspeed indicator climbing past 450 miles per hour. He lined up on the nearest Bf-109, which was making a firing pass on a damaged B-17. The Lightning's nose-mounted guns converged perfectly. Bong fired a 2-second burst. The Bf-109 disintegrated. The German formation broke in confusion. They had never seen a P-38 move that fast. Bong didn't slow down. He pulled out of the dive, used the speed to climb vertically, and then rolled over to engage another target. A second Bf-109 exploded, then a third. Within 90 seconds, Bong had killed 3 German fighters and scattered the rest. But he had also burned through most of his speed, and the remaining German pilots realized what was happening. They began to coordinate, trying to force Bong into a turning fight where the P-38's lack of maneuverability would be fatal. 4 FW-190s converged on him from different angles, cutting off his escape routes. Bong didn't try to turn with them. He dove again, straight down, pushing the Lightning past 500 miles per hour. The German pilots followed, but their aircraft couldn't match that speed in a sustained dive. The control surfaces on the FW-190s began to stiffen. One pilot tried to pull out too early and blacked out from the G-forces. His plane slammed into a field below. Bong leveled out at 3,000 feet, used the speed to climb again, and repositioned above the bombers. The remaining German fighters had broken off, unwilling to continue the engagement. Bong escorted the damaged B-17s back to the English coast, landed at an emergency airfield, and filed his after-action report. He had shot down 3 confirmed kills and damaged 2 others. He had saved a bomber formation, and he had done it alone, in a plane that German intelligence said shouldn't have been able to survive that kind of fight. Now I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what moments of the day or night these documented accounts reach. Within days, the report reached Luftwaffe headquarters. Analysts reviewed the engagement, cross-referenced it with radio intercepts and pilot testimony, and came to a conclusion that horrified them. The American pilot hadn't been lucky. He had been methodical. exploiting the Lightning's advantages with a level of precision that suggested the Luftwaffe's tactical assessments were fundamentally wrong. A revised intelligence bulletin was issued on October 20th, 1943. It was marked Urgent, All Fighter Commands. The title was simple: Reassessment of P-38 Lightning Threat Level. The document acknowledged that previous assumptions about the Lightning's vulnerabilities were incomplete. It noted that American pilots were developing tactics that negated the plane's weaknesses and amplified its strengths, and it concluded with a warning. Engagement with P-38 formations should be avoided unless numerical superiority is overwhelming. Solo engagements are not recommended under any circumstances. The bulletin didn't mention Richard Bong by name, but German pilots began to whisper about the Twin Devil pilot, an American ace who flew a Lightning like it was invincible. And slowly, reluctantly, the Luftwaffe began to understand that the P-38 wasn't just dangerous, it was rewriting the rules of air combat. By the winter of 1943, Luftwaffe squadrons had developed a clear tactical doctrine for engaging P-38 Lightnings: force them low, force them slow, and exploit their poor maneuverability in turning fights. The doctrine was based on sound analysis. The P-38's large size and twin-boom configuration created significant drag in low-speed flight. Its ailerons were heavy at low airspeeds, making sharp turns difficult. And its roll rate, the speed at which it could rotate around its longitudinal axis, was significantly worse than that of German single-engine fighters. The problem was that American pilots weren't cooperating. Captain Heinrich Ehrler, a Luftwaffe ace with over 200 kills on the Eastern Front, was transferred to France in December 1943 to help develop countermeasures against Allied fighter tactics. He had flown against Soviet Yaks, LeGGs, and early-model American Airacobras, and he understood energy management and vertical combat better than most. When he first encountered a P-38 formation over the Rhine Valley, he thought he knew exactly how to kill them. He positioned his flight of Bf-109s below the Lightnings, climbing slowly to tempt them into diving. The P-38s took the bait and dove, accelerating rapidly. Ehrler waited until they were at his altitude, then broke hard into them, forcing a turning engagement. The P-38s didn't turn. They kept their speed, extended away in a shallow climb, and then came back around from a different angle. Ehrler tried to follow, but his Bf-109 couldn't match their acceleration in the climb. By the time he repositioned, the Lightnings were gone. He tried again 3 days later. This time he used a different approach. He stayed high, dove on the P-38s from above, and tried to force them into a slow-speed scissors maneuver, a series of reversing turns that would negate their speed advantage. The P-38s didn't engage. They simply split into pairs, one diving while the other climbed, creating a vertical separation that made coordinated attack impossible. Ehrler's flight tried to follow, but the Lightning's superior climb rate allowed it to regain altitude faster than the Bf-109s could pursue. In his after-action report, Ehrler wrote, "The P-38 pilot who understands his aircraft is almost impossible to engage effectively. He will not turn. He will not slow down. He will not fight on our terms. And if we force the engagement, he will simply leave and return from a position of advantage." Luftwaffe intelligence analyzed dozens of similar reports and identified a pattern. American P-38 pilots were using a tactic called boom and zoom, diving from altitude, making a single high-speed pass, and then climbing away before German fighters could react. The tactic wasn't new. German pilots had used it extensively on the Eastern Front, but the P-38's combination of speed, firepower, and climb rate made it devastatingly effective. The Luftwaffe's response was to develop new tactics focused on denying the P-38 its altitude advantage. Squadrons began positioning high-altitude patrols specifically to intercept climbing Lightnings. They used radio coordination to set up ambushes at altitudes where the P-38's performance was still strong, but German fighters could maintain parity. And they emphasized disciplined defensive flying, refusing to chase P-38s that extended away after an engagement. It worked to an extent. Losses among P-38 squadrons increased in early 1944 as German pilots became more cautious and disciplined. But the fundamental problem remained. The P-38 dictated the terms of combat. If a Lightning pilot was patient, skilled, and disciplined, there was little a German pilot could do except hope for a mistake. And the best American pilots didn't make mistakes. By the spring of 1944, Luftwaffe morale was eroding. Pilots who had dominated the skies over Europe for years were now flying defensively, conserving fuel, avoiding engagements, and counting themselves lucky when they survived a mission without encountering P-38s. The twin-boom fighter that had looked like a design mistake had become the plane they feared most. But there was another problem, one that German intelligence was only beginning to understand. The P-38 wasn't just winning air-to-air engagements. It was being used in roles that single-engine fighters couldn't perform. It was escorting bombers on missions deep into Germany. It was conducting long-range reconnaissance. It was ground attacking with devastating effectiveness. And it was doing all of this with a reliability and range that made it nearly impossible to counter. The P-38 Lightning had been designed as a high-altitude interceptor, but in practice it had become something far more dangerous, a multi-role fighter that could fight, escort, scout, and strike with equal effectiveness. And the Luftwaffe, stretched thin and bleeding aircraft faster than they could be replaced, had no counter for it. The weakness German pilots had hoped to exploit, the Lightning's poor maneuverability, only mattered if they could force the plane into the kind of fight where maneuverability was decisive. And increasingly, they couldn't. The Luftwaffe's training system, once the finest in the world, was collapsing by 1944. Experienced instructors had been pulled back to frontline squadrons to replace losses. Fuel shortages meant new pilots received fewer flight hours before being sent into combat, and the training they did receive was based on tactics developed for a war that no longer existed. Lieutenant Klaus Weber graduated from flight school in March 1944 with 70 hours of flight time in the Bf 109. He had never seen a P-38 Lightning except in reconnaissance photographs. His instructors had told him the twin-engine American fighter was clumsy, vulnerable in turns, and easy to kill if engaged correctly. When he arrived at his squadron near Regensburg, the veterans told him something different. If you see a Lightning, run. If you can't run, pray. Weber didn't believe them. He was young, confident, and convinced that superior German engineering and tactics would prevail. On his third combat mission, he found out why the veterans were afraid. His flight of 4 Bf 109s was patrolling at 25,000 feet when they spotted a formation of 6 P-38s escorting B-17 bombers. Weber's flight leader ordered an attack. They dove from above, using their altitude advantage to build speed. The P-38s didn't scatter. They turned into the attack, presenting their nose-mounted guns. Weber's flight leader fired first, a long burst that missed. The P-38s returned fire. One Bf 109 exploded instantly, the concentrated firepower from multiple Lightnings tearing it apart in mid-air. Weber broke right, trying to get behind one of the P-38s. The Lightning didn't try to turn with him. It rolled inverted, pulled through, and dove vertically. Weber followed, confident he could stay with it. But the P-38 accelerated faster than he expected, and within seconds it was out of range. Weber pulled out of the dive and looked around. His flight was gone. One dead, two scattered, and him alone in the middle of a sky full of American fighters. A P-38 appeared on his left, matching his speed, flying formation with him. The pilot looked over, made eye contact, and gestured for Weber to turn toward Allied lines and surrender. Weber was too terrified to do anything but comply. He flew west for 30 seconds, then broke hard and dove for the deck, racing back toward German territory at full throttle. The P-38 didn't chase him. It simply climbed back to altitude and rejoined the bomber escort. Weber made it back to base. He never flew another combat mission. He was reassigned to a training unit 2 weeks later, diagnosed with combat fatigue, and spent the rest of the war teaching new pilots how to avoid the mistakes he had made. But Weber was one of the lucky ones. Most German pilots who encountered P-38s in 1944 didn't get a second chance. If this story has surprised you, leave a like to help the channel. Oberleutnant Franz Stiegler had been flying combat missions since 1940. He had survived the Battle of Britain, the Eastern Front, and North Africa. He had 283 kills and was one of the most experienced pilots in the Luftwaffe. In June 1944, he was assigned to a squadron tasked with intercepting Allied fighter bombers over France. On June 8, 1944, Stiegler's flight engaged a group of P-38s conducting a ground attack near Caen. Stiegler used every trick he had learned in 4 years of combat. He positioned himself with the sun behind him, dove from altitude, and fired on a Lightning that was pulling off a strafing run. His bullets hit the P-38's right engine, which began trailing smoke. The Lightning rolled hard, dove toward the ground, and then leveled out at treetop height. Stiegler followed, convinced the damaged aircraft was finished. But the P-38 didn't slow down. It continued flying on one engine, maintaining speed and altitude that shouldn't have been possible. Stiegler stayed on its tail, waiting for it to crash, or for the pilot to bail out. Neither happened. The Lightning flew 15 miles back toward Allied lines, found a grass airfield, and executed a perfect single-engine landing. Stiegler watched from above, stunned. He had damaged the plane badly enough that it should have been a kill. But the P-38's twin-engine design, redundant systems, and structural strength had allowed it to survive. Stiegler returned to base and wrote in his logbook, "Damaged P-38, no kill. Aircraft will not die." Stories like Stiegler's circulated among Luftwaffe squadrons, adding to the Lightning's growing reputation. It wasn't just that the plane was fast or well-armed. It was that it was resilient. Pilots who managed to land hits found that the P-38 could absorb punishment that would destroy a single-engine fighter. And even when damaged, it could often make it home. By the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe was losing the air war. Fuel shortages, pilot losses, and overwhelming Allied numbers meant that even when German pilots fought brilliantly, they were being ground down through attrition. The P-38 Lightning wasn't the only reason they were losing. But for the pilots who encountered it, the twin-boom fighter had become a symbol of everything they couldn't overcome. American industrial power, superior resources, and a machine designed to survive and kill in ways they hadn't anticipated. The pilots who learned to respect the P-38 early survived. The ones who learned too late didn't. In April 1944, Luftwaffe intelligence compiled a comprehensive assessment of Allied fighter capabilities. The report, titled Comparative Analysis of Enemy Fighter Aircraft, Tactical Recommendations, was distributed to Jagdgeschwader commanders across occupied Europe. It analyzed the strengths and weaknesses of the P-51 Mustang, the P-47 Thunderbolt, and the P-38 Lightning, and provided tactical guidance for engaging each type. The section on the P-38 was the longest and most detailed. It acknowledged the Lightning's speed, firepower, and operational range. It noted the plane's vulnerability in low-speed turning fights, but emphasized that American pilots were increasingly avoiding those engagements. And it concluded with a stark recommendation: avoid prolonged engagement with P-38 formations unless overwhelming numerical superiority can be maintained. Prioritize engagement with slower, more maneuverable Allied types. The report was read, filed, and largely ignored. Not because its conclusions were wrong, But because by April 1944, the Luftwaffe no longer had the luxury of choosing which fights to take. Allied air superiority was absolute. German fighters were being forced into defensive roles, scrambling to intercept bomber formations regardless of escort strength. And when P-38s were present, German pilots had no choice but to engage or watch the bombers destroy their targets unmolested. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, a highly decorated fighter ace and squadron commander, read the intelligence report and understood its implications immediately. He had been flying combat missions since 1939 and had seen the evolution of air warfare firsthand. In a private letter to a fellow officer dated May 1944, he wrote, "We are losing not because our pilots lack skill or courage, but because we are fighting a war we are no longer equipped to win. The Americans have built fighters that exploit our weaknesses while negating our strengths. The P-38 is the perfect example. It refuses to fight on our terms, and we lack the resources to force it into engagements where we have an advantage." The letter was never sent. Steinhoff kept it in his personal files, and it was discovered decades later by historians researching Luftwaffe operations. But the sentiment it expressed was shared by many German pilots in the final year of the war. They were fighting brilliantly against impossible odds, and the P-38 Lightning had become a symbol of that impossibility. In June 1944, a second intelligence report was issued, titled Updated Threat Assessment Allied Twin-Engine Fighters. It was shorter, more urgent, and more pessimistic than the first. It noted that P-38 losses had decreased significantly as American pilots gained experience, while Luftwaffe losses continued to climb. It acknowledged that German fighters could still win individual engagements against Lightnings, but that the overall trend was irreversible. And it concluded with a recommendation that was as much a surrender as a tactical assessment. Conserve pilot strength, avoid unnecessary risk, focus defensive efforts on bomber formations rather than escort fighters. The report was classified and distributed only to senior commanders. Rank-and-file pilots never saw it, but they didn't need to. They could see the truth every time they took off. The sky belonged to the Americans now, and the twin-boom fighter they had once dismissed as clumsy was one of the reasons why. By the autumn of 1944, German pilots were flying fewer missions, conserving fuel and avoiding engagements whenever possible. The Luftwaffe was collapsing not from lack of skill or courage, but from simple attrition, and the P-38 Lightning, the plane that looked like a mistake, had played a quiet but decisive role in that collapse. The intelligence reports that warned of this outcome had been accurate, but they had arrived too late, and even if they hadn't, the Luftwaffe lacked the resources to act on them. The war was lost in the air long before it was lost on the ground, and the pilots who survived knew it. Major Günther Rall had 375 confirmed kills by the end of World War II, making him the third highest-scoring fighter ace in history. He had flown on the Eastern Front in North Africa and over the Reich. He had survived being shot down 8 times, and he had fought against every Allied fighter type deployed in the European theatre. But in the decades after the war, when historians and aviation enthusiasts asked him about his experiences, there was one plane he rarely discussed, the P-38 Lightning. In 1978, during a rare interview at an aviation museum in Germany, Rall was asked directly about the Lightning. His response was brief. It was a difficult opponent, well-armed, fast, and flown by pilots who understood its capabilities. I respected it. When pressed for details, he declined. Some planes you remember because they were easy to fight. Others you remember because they were not. The P-38 was not. But Rall kept a private journal during the war, and in it he was more candid. In an entry dated August 12, 1944, he wrote, "Engaged P-38s today over Munich. We had altitude advantage, numerical superiority, and experience. We should have won. But they refused to fight the way we expected. They stayed fast, stayed vertical, and left when the engagement turned against them. We shot down one, they shot down three of ours. This is the new reality. The enemy chooses when and how to fight, and we react. It was not always this way. RAL survived the war and lived until 2009, long enough to see the P-38 Lightning celebrated as one of the great fighters of World War II. He attended air shows, spoke at conferences, and met with American veterans who had flown the plane. In private conversations, he was generous in his praise. But he never spoke publicly about what it had been like to face the Lightning at the height of the air war, when German pilots were still confident and the outcome was not yet decided. In 2003, an American P-38 pilot named Robert Johnson met RAL at a reunion event in Arizona. Johnson had flown escort missions over Germany in 1944 and had encountered RAL's squadron on at least 2 occasions. The two men spoke briefly, compared notes, and discovered they had likely been in the same engagement over Stuttgart in September 1944. RAL asked Johnson why American P-38 pilots had been so effective. Johnson's answer was simple. We were taught to use the plane's strengths and avoid its weaknesses, and we had the fuel, the numbers, and the training to do it consistently. RAL nodded. That is the correct answer. But it is also the reason we lost. The conversation ended there. Neither man elaborated, and no recording of the exchange exists. But the sentiment captured something essential about the P-38's role in the air war. It was not invincible, but it was flown by pilots who understood how to make it effective. And in the end, that made all the difference. Günter RAL died in 2009 at the age of 91. His journal, along with other personal papers, was donated to a military archive in Bavaria. The entries about the P-38 remain there, rarely accessed, a testament to the respect and frustration of a man who had fought brilliantly and lost. In the decades after World War II, the P-38 Lightning's reputation evolved. It was celebrated in films, books, and documentaries as one of the most distinctive and effective fighters of the war. But its story was often simplified, reduced to narratives of American ingenuity and heroism that ignored the complexities of its development and deployment. The truth was more nuanced. The P-38 was not a perfect aircraft. It suffered from engine problems, inadequate cockpit heating, and handling quirks that killed inexperienced pilots. Its poor performance in turning fights meant that in certain tactical situations it was vulnerable, and its reputation among German pilots was not uniform. Some feared it, others respected it, and a few dismissed it as overrated. But what made the P-38 dangerous was not the plane itself. It was the way American pilots were trained to use it. They understood that the Lightning's strengths, speed, firepower, climb rate and range, could be leveraged to dominate engagements if they avoided prolonged turning fights. They developed tactics that played to those strengths, and they executed them with discipline and consistency. In 1997, a German aviation historian named Klaus Fischer published a study titled Luftwaffe Tactical Evolution, 1943-1945. One chapter focused on the P-38 Lightning and its impact on German fighter tactics. Fischer interviewed surviving Luftwaffe pilots and analyzed after-action reports from the final 2 years of the war. His conclusion: the P-38 was not the most dangerous Allied fighter in terms of raw performance. The P-51 Mustang was faster, and the P-47 Thunderbolt was more rugged. But the P-38 was the most psychologically disruptive. Its appearance over the battlefield signaled that the Americans had the resources, the training, and the tactical sophistication to dominate any engagement they chose. For German pilots, this was more demoralizing than facing a technically superior opponent. Fischer's study was well received in academic circles, but largely ignored by popular aviation historians. The narrative of the P-38 as a flawed but beloved fighter persisted, overshadowing the more complex reality of its role in the air war. In 2011, a P-38 enthusiast named Michael Strom located a declassified Luftwaffe intelligence report from 1944 in the U.S. National Archives. The report, titled Final Assessment, P-38 Lightning Threat Profile, had been compiled in the final months of the war and was intended as a training document for the few remaining German fighter pilots. It was blunt. The P-38 is not invincible, but it is flown by pilots who understand air combat better than we currently do. Avoid engagement unless circumstances are overwhelmingly favorable. Survival is the priority. Strom published excerpts from the report in an aviation journal, sparking renewed interest in the Lightning's wartime reputation. But the broader public remained largely unaware. The P-38's image as a distinctive, photogenic fighter with twin booms and a central nacelle continued to define its legacy, while the tactical and psychological dimensions of its effectiveness remained a footnote. The P-38 Lightning was not the fastest fighter of World War II. It was not the most maneuverable. It was not even the most heavily produced. But it was the plane that German aces feared because it refused to fight on their terms. It climbed when they expected it to turn. It extended when they expected it to engage, and it killed with a precision and consistency that eroded both morale and confidence. The war ended more than 80 years ago. The Lightning's distinctive silhouette has been preserved in museums and celebrated in air shows. But the lessons it taught, that air combat is not won by the best plane, but by the best tactics and the best training, remain as relevant today as they were in the skies over occupied Europe. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and unsettling cases. Thank you for following the story of the P-38 Lightning. We'll see you in the next video.